I don't run into people at the water cooler anymore. We're not having lunch together. We don't have those little moments at the beginning of meetings. And those are the backbone of building long-lasting relationships, as small as they sound.
Hello, and welcome to this episode of the Ask Valor Masterminds podcast, brought to you by A Advanced Services and Fuse Networks. My name's Galen.
I'm Joe.
We're coming at you from the Creative Block Studios in Seattle, Washington. So, Joe, for new listeners and viewers tuning in for the first time, how did our podcast come to be?
Sure. It first started out as a Facebook group page, and the purpose was just to bring businesses together to communicate, talk, share tips, ask questions, kind of brainstorm together. And we're in a networking group, and someone approached us about starting a podcast together. And so we thought, what a good idea to bring different guest speakers onto the podcast to kind of just do that same thing in the Facebook group page, which is just to educate our audience on different topics for small business owners and entrepreneurs and how to implement it into their business to help them be successful.
Awesome. And all the way from the West Coast, coming from the East Coast, we'd like to introduce our guest today, Mr. Jake Fishbein. Jake, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Galen. It's great to be here.
All right. So we're out west, you're out east. Today's topic is how to build long-lasting relationships. We're not going to be talking about long-distance relationships, like that kind of functional kind of stuff, therapy or anything, but we'll talk about business relationships. So can you please introduce yourself to our audience, Jake?
Absolutely. As you said, my name is Jake Fishbein. Some people call me Coach Jake. I'm an executive coach, facilitator, men's work leader, and soon to be author. I help people become better communicators and make and navigate their most important choices. I work both in the corporate sphere, doing executive coaching and trainings, and also I run men's groups to bring men together, in particular to work on building long-lasting relationships.
Nice. I got to ask, how did you get into doing what you're doing?
Well, it's a long story, but the Spark Notes version is in my first career in public relations, which I did not like. A friend of a friend of a friend recommended I do a series of workshops and work with a coach. I did the workshops. They changed my life. I called the coach, and he became my mentor. And we've been working on a novel together about a men's group for 8 years. We run a men's group together, which we've been running for 4 years. And that launched me into doing this work. I really fell in love with how coaching is all about helping people learn, which is something I've loved doing since I was a kid, is learning.
Mm-hmm. So speaking of learning, what are some early lessons learned as an entrepreneur?
So a few come to mind right away. My first big entrepreneurial venture was a company called Experience Vinyl, which was a Vinyl of the Month subscription company in 2016, 2017, 2018, right at the craze when that was happening. And there were two lessons I learned in that business. The first one was, just because you have money to spend doesn't mean that money solves all of the problems, especially when building a business early on. We had an angel investor and threw money at problems. We did a $100,000 marketing campaign, and we really had no business doing it. And I learned from that experience that just because we had the money doesn't mean throwing it at things we didn't want to do or weren't good at was the correct answer at that time in the business. One of the things I learned was, because we had that funding, we built our perfect product from day one. So we had an amazing product. We partnered with rock stars like Carlos Santana, who chose their favorite album to get pressed on limited edition vinyl. But we didn't have a customer base to back up the perfect product. So we had a product that cost a lot of money to build, but not the customers to buy it. And that was a really big lesson, which is just because we could do something didn't mean that we should.
Yeah.
The second lesson I learned, which was much more applicable at the time, was that when running a business, it didn't really matter what my personal feelings were about something. I had to think about what the business itself needed. And I use this when even talking about relationships. You think about a relationship as being an entity of its own, that if two people share a relationship, they share the relationship itself. It's like a third entity. And just like a business, I co-founded Experience Vinyl with a friend of mine. We both had our relationship together, but we also had the business to look out for. And there were times where I didn't want to do things like fire somebody because it was really uncomfortable personally to have that conversation. But I knew that for the good of the business, it's what I needed to do. And that lesson has served me really well, both as an entrepreneur, but also just as a human, to think about, what is this endeavor? What is this business? What is this idea? What does this relationship need that I can give it? not what do I want to do, because those two
Right.
things don't always line up.
All right.
So because of the journey that you've been on, I'm curious, what's the best piece of advice that you've been given?
So one actually happened recently. It was a few months ago, and I've been building my own coaching business for the past 5.5 years and have gone through ups and downs since I've done that. And I was having a conversation with my father towards the end of the summer, and I was telling him, I said, Dad, I really just want to build a sustainable business. And he looked at me, we were on FaceTime because he's in New Mexico where I grew up. And he said, Jake, it's not about building a sustainable business. It's about building a sustainable life. And that's really stuck with me because it is oftentimes the focus of my work is the holistic, is the whole. But it's so easy as an entrepreneur to get sucked into how's my business doing? What's my revenue at? How many people am I impacting? And not thinking about how is this impacting me as a whole? Am I building a sustainable life, or am I just building a sustainable business? And as we're going to talk about today in long-lasting relationships, my perspective is the relationships are what matter far more than whatever I create in the business. And so that advice really, really stuck out with me. Another piece of advice I'll share is something I learned from my first boss ever when I worked in public relations. And he said that there are 3 types of work. There's the work that you want to do, the work that your clients want you to do, and the work that gets you paid. And you have to do all 3. And I think about that a lot too, because so much of the messaging, especially my generation gets, millennials, is that we should do something we're passionate about and forget the things that we're not. And that line from my boss, my first boss here in New York City, stands out because it's true. You have to focus on all 3. Otherwise, as my dad said, that's actually not building a sustainable life or a sustainable business.
All right. So last question, since this technically is a marketing podcast, why is marketing important in your words?
I believe that marketing is important because marketing is what people see. And ultimately, for me, I grow my business almost entirely based on referrals. And so my marketing is how I'm interacting with the people in my world. That people want to work with people who they like, people who they connect with, people who they feel comfortable with, people that they trust. And marketing is the vehicle for building that trust. Without trust, there is no success in business, at least no sustainable long-term success. And marketing is one route to building that credibility and trust, especially on a larger scale outside of just the person-to-person interactions.
Awesome. Thank you for that. Now we come to the part of our podcast, our A Advanced Services Pump You Up Quote of the Day. Joe, do you mind reading this for us, please?
Sure. A man needs a little madness, or else he never dares, or else he never dares cut the rope and be free. Zorba the Greek. Why does this quote resonate with you?
So Zorba has been an influential movie and book for me since I was a kid. My grandmother loved it, and my parents loved it. And the first time I watched it, I had no idea what it was about. But in college, actually after college, I rewatched it and I read the book. And I had always been someone who was very much in their heads. I spent a lot of time thinking, a lot of time dreaming, a lot of time overthinking, overanalyzing, thinking about what I should have done or what I could do. And Zorba the Greek is all about living out in the world. It's about being alive, about being present, about taking risks, about having that madness. And this line comes at the end of the film, and I always really resonated with it because it always felt like it was speaking to me and speaking to so many people out there to be willing to have a little madness, because madness really is cutting the rope. It is saying, I don't have to play by the rules. I don't have to do this just because someone said it's a good idea or it's the way things should be done. But that willingness to be authentically myself, authentically expressed, and just live no holds barred in the world. It's always been so inspiring because my natural tendency is to live completely opposite that, with no madness, with very, very by the book, very safe. And so every time I watch the film or read the book, or just remember that quote, I have a image of Zorba the Greek dancing above my computer here, actually. It's a
Yeah, we're not
reminder.
doing any dances. Don't think like I told you right before we went on. Joe and I aren't going to do the last dance in the movie. We're not going to get crazy or anything. So we hadn't rehearsed in time to do that. Maybe in a future time we get a flash mob
I'll
to
fly out
break
to
out and do the
Seattle,
dance.
Galen, and we can do it together.
There you go. Pike Place Market. You're throwing fish, and we're doing the last dance right there,
Exactly.
right?
To be fair,
We're gonna cut some fish loose and get going from there. All right. Good transition in our Fuse Networks Did You Know segment.
Millions of cybercriminals are out there on a daily basis trying to steal your information. It's not a matter of if, it's when. Small businesses account for 58% of cyber attacks annually. So help your company fight cybercrime and mitigate risk by being proactive. Call Fuse Networks, your local Seattle IT experts at 206-701-6040 for a complimentary IT network and security assessment.
So there's a couple of statements that you shared with us that since how to build long-lasting relationships is really the topic, we want to transition into that. So this first one I want to read and get your thoughts. So according to the American Journal of Psychiatry in 2020, people who have friends and close confidants are more satisfied with their lives and less likely to suffer from depression. So obviously we just came off a pandemic. Relationships, being isolated, mental health kind of came to the forefront of different things, both personally and business, from all ages, even from my children on up. Talk to us about that. Why did you choose to share that with us today on the podcast?
as I think about building long-lasting relationships, I think it's about so much more than just business, so much more than just friendship or romantic relationships or familiar relationships. It really encompasses all of those. And as we think about building sustainable lives, and that includes building sustainable businesses, our relationships are the backbone of that. Health and relationships, you could say. But there's a great study by Tal Ben-Shahar of the Happiness Studies Academy who did a study on resilience. And he said that the number one predictor of people's happiness and resilience was their relationships. And I think this quote from the American Journal of Psychiatry really reaffirms that people, my experience, especially I do a lot of work with men in running men's groups, men don't tend to invest in their relationships, at least not on a deep level beyond the surface. And it's a broad generalization. Of course, I know many men who deeply invest in their relationships, but it's almost like relationships are tossed to the side. There's a very transactional nature to them, especially in the business world. And one of the greatest lessons I've learned from sales is I'd rather build a relationship with someone and tell them not to buy my product because it's not right for them, and build that trust, because the chances are they're going to come back to me in the future, than just look at them as a lost cause and move on. And I think that plays the same role in this, that looking at relationships as filling our own buckets and protecting ourselves from experiencing depression and anxiety. That post-COVID, everything is more isolated. I'm on a computer. I'm not in Seattle with you two. It's so great you're there in person. And so many people are so much more isolated now, not really having the tools to invest in relationships. I do a lot of work with corporate executives, and so many of them are remote now, and they ask me, how do I build my network? I don't run into people at the water cooler anymore. We're not having lunch together. We don't have those little moments at the beginning of meetings. And those are the backbone of building long-lasting relationships, as small as they sound. And it requires so much more intentionality and purposefulness today to build relationships, where in the past, those moments were a given. They were part of the fabric of just our work lives. And one final piece I'll say on this. I was once speaking with a friend of a friend who's a venture capitalist, a big investor. He invested in Blue Apron. And he said that his firm ran a study of all of the companies they invested in. And what they discovered is that their employees really didn't care about what they were doing, about the actual tasks of their job. They cared far more about who they were working with. And I hear that time and time again, that people are unhappy because their colleagues don't work well. They don't communicate well. They're absurd standards, and no one is having honest conversations. Not because the work itself is hard. And people don't have strong relationships at work. That's going to lead to a lot more depression and anxiety at home.
Right. We even had a guest in studio a little bit ago, Casey Jaycox. He wrote a book, Win the Relationship, Not the Deal. So when you're talking about that, it brought me back to, look, even on the sales side, which he wrote the book on, it's so much more important to create that relationship, that level of trust, even though you can't service them. Oftentimes, you never know, they may come back. Let's move on to the next one. Joe, do you mind reading
Yep.
our next stat, please?
A narrow majority of adults, 53%, say they have between 1 and 4 close friends, while a significant share, 38%, say they have 5 or more. Some 8% say they have no close friends. What's your thoughts? I mean, I read those stats, and I would say that's probably true. I'm probably in the majority of I have this many close friends, trusted friends that,
Your circle.
My circle, our tribe is a tight knit circle, a tight knit tribe. So I would agree with the stat, but I'm curious on your thoughts.
Yeah, I would agree with it too. It's my experience working with people is that most people don't have all that many really close friends that they trust. Mm-hmm. And it's one of the reasons why I run men's groups. In particular, these stats are even lower for men. And I think there's a stat we're going to talk about in a second related to that, because men are having fewer close friends. And this stat actually, I forget the statistics from 20 or 30 years ago, but these numbers are going down. That people used to say they had more close friends. And our society, especially as it becomes more virtual, and I hear time and time again, I was working with a client actually last week, and they were saying how they had a story that it wasn't okay to have friends at work. Mm-hmm. And it's one of the biggest issues I see is people say at work they're not allowed to have friends, and these are people are interacting with all the time. So why not have trusted confidants at work? Just because it's work doesn't mean that those relationships aren't real or important. But this stat speaks to me because if we're limiting the number of people we trust, we're limiting the amount of advice we can get, the number of perspectives we can get, and the diversity of that advice and perspective. And one of the things that I find so valuable about running groups and being in groups is having 10 or 15 people who are in that close friend network. They may not be best friends, but they can be trusted and relied on and there to support you or the person who's there. And we actually just did an exercise based around sharing, where each guy in our group, our men's group's called the Arena Men's Group, they have to share 5 things that are going on in their life right now that it's either giving them anxiety or exciting them. And after those 5 things, the instruction was to go share the thing that scared them the most with a male friend. Because this is how we build long-lasting relationships, by sharing intimate details with each other, by leaning on each other, by asking for support and showing that vulnerability. And that's how we boost these statistics so that maybe we have a few more close friends. I don't think it's worth it to have 15, 20, 30 people who we claim are our close friends, because that doesn't feel realistic. But it really pains me to think of those 8% who say they have no close friends. I mean, that's almost 1 out of 10 people in a room.
Right.
Yeah. But I think as we get older, when you're kids, you're going through high school, you think it's important to be popular and know everyone. And then I think as you get older in life, you kind of cut certain people out of your life that
priorities change.
It's not a mutual beneficial relationship. You don't have those close ties with anymore. So as we get older, we just cut people out in your circle.
Titans.
Lessons. Or titans. That's a great word, titans. So,
all right. For the purpose of time, I'm just going to skip one and then go to this one, just because for our audience, entrepreneurs who recognize the importance of nurturing deep, genuine relationships stand apart in the crowded marketplace. So talk to us about that. We have an audience of entrepreneurs tuning in. They're anxious to hear your thoughts.
Again, I think relationships are the biggest indicator of a successful business. That investing in those relationships, especially for a sustainable business, is the thing that matters the most. And that matters whether you're an entrepreneur, whether you're an employee for someone. Time and time again, when I work with job seekers, it's just saying it's all about who you know. And it's the same with growing a business, that the relationships that you have with people who trust you are your greatest resource. Just hands down. More than the value of your content, more than the money you have in your bank. It's the quality of those trusted relationships. And that even extends beyond that to if you're running a company with multiple employees, your relationship with the people who work for you is one of your greatest resources too. And it's so important to nourish those deep, meaningful relationships on a human level, because that's what comes back to all of us. We're social creatures. And our world continues to increase the use of technology to decrease human interaction. You see it at the supermarket, where there are a lot more self-checkouts now than there used to be. And I get it from a standpoint of efficiency, of cost effectiveness, but losing those human connections has an incredibly harmful impact on our quality of life and ultimately the quality of our businesses. because we're not doing
Right. Look
business
at,
with
I mean, look,
computers.
you can buy cars now without talking to someone. I mean, the transactional piece, like you go to Amazon and I want to buy this. I don't have to talk to a checkout person. I'll read the reviews. It's a lot of transactional stuff that relationships now are almost like transactional, not like real stuff. So I guess the question I want to ask, so if you, what points, tips, advice would you give to a new business who just started, who may not have those long lasting relationships in the marketplace? They're good at what they do. They're passionate. They have a team that they trust. What would you say to that entrepreneur on how to build those as you're growing a business, that you haven't been in business for 20, 30 years, but you don't have this? What are some tips you could give to those people?
Yeah. Well, first, go meet some people and go do it with the intention of getting to know them as human beings, not making a business deal. Whether that's joining a business network, whether it's going to a conference, whether it's talking with someone else in the industry if you have business partners and who own other businesses, and asking who they know and who you should meet. And when you meet those people, again, make it about getting to know them as a human being and what might be possible for the two of you, not about how they can benefit your bottom line today. That relationships are like a bank account, that you want to continually make deposits in the relationship, because one day it might come back to you. It might not, but it very well might. It might come back to you in the way that you least expect it. So that's the first thing I'd say. The other is a strategy that I recommend to almost everybody, which is to make your list of all-stars. And your all-stars are people in your network. They might be other business owners. They might be mentors. They might be people who you don't know yet who are potential all-stars. Make your list of all-stars. So these tend to be people who are influential in their community, in their industry, and people who would do anything for you. And with your list of all-stars, about 10 or 15, every month, make a deposit in those relationships. But also, if you're a new business and you're trying to break into a marketplace and build relationships, ask those people who you should know. Ask those people for the introductions. That I know for me, breaking into the coaching industry, the biggest way that I've met people is by going to training programs, by being willing to connect with someone just one-on-one, by saying yes to any introduction that came my way, by being very curious and open and wanting to provide value, and by leaning on the people who've supported me the whole way. I'm very lucky that one of my mentors is one of the founders of the coaching profession and used to drive me to camp during the summer. We have a very long-standing relationship from when I was 7, 8 years old. And
That's pretty cool.
It's super cool, and it's transformed a lot over the years. But he's someone that I lean on in order to build new relationships in this industry. Because one way of building new relationships is by leveraging your existing relationships.
One of the things that you mentioned about reminds me of like the BNI networking group, right? So I'm sure you're familiar with BNI. I know Galen's familiar with BNI. I've been a member for like 7 years. But it's that mindset of get to know the people in your group first and learn how you can help them grow their business. Because if you help enough people get what they want, then eventually it comes back tenfold for you and your business.
Absolutely. It's always about, in my mind, focusing outward, making a difference for the people around me, because I know that that's an investment in my business, in myself, in my life. We talk about marketing. That's a version of marketing, is going to make a difference for the people in your communities, whether it's BNI, whether it's something else, because that's how people get to know you. And I'm convinced people want to work with people, want to help people they like.
Yeah. So if our audience wanted to get in touch with you, what's the best way for them to connect?
The best way is via my email, which is jake@jakefishbein.com. I check my email all the time, so you're definitely going to reach me. You can also learn more about me at jakefishbein.com or about the men's group I run at thearenaseries.com. I'm also on LinkedIn. Just don't find me on Instagram or Facebook. I'm barely there.
So you mentioned an upcoming book you have. What's the title of the book that you'll be releasing?
So the book is called The Men's Group, and it's a fictional portrayal about a fictional men's group. It's about the importance of relationships, about the importance of communication, and about the difference that surrounding yourself with people and being honest has on relationships of all kinds. So I just received back the final edits on the final draft today. And it's a novel, so once that's done, we're going to begin pitching it to agents in a couple weeks. So if you're an agent out there looking to publish a really cool book about men, about relationships, about disrupting the paradigm that's out there, We're looking for one to help us spread this message to people all over the world.
Awesome. So thank you again for joining us today. A lot of great insights. It's almost like a refresh. We talk a lot with a lot of different coaches, more on technical stuff, but to break it down, like real relationships, like still matter. It's good to hear that sometimes. So on behalf of our sponsors, A Advanced Services and Fuse Networks, my name's Galen.
And I'm Joe.
Coming at you from the Creative Block Studios in Seattle, Washington, all the way from the East Coast. Jake, thanks for joining us. If you're ever in town, sit next to us right here. But thank you for joining us today. And thanks everyone for watching and tuning in to this episode of the Ask Valor Masterminds podcast. Thanks everyone.